faith, family, freedom, hope, and opportunity. You're listening to Freedom Rings. I'm your host, Senator Marsha Blackburn. Today, I am so pleased to welcome Leora Levy to our Freedom Rings podcast. Leora is such a good, solid conservative. She is running to represent the wonderful people of Connecticut in the U.S. Senate. And Leora, you have really dedicated your life to fighting for our good, solid conservative values. And I just know that our listeners are going to love to hear about your life story and how you have really, and your family have really had to fight for that freedom. And you were born in Havana, Cuba, and you and your family escaped Castro's communist revolution. And I think our listeners would love to hear a little bit more about that story of your family escaping and coming to America.
Well, thank you for that, Marsha, and I'm very happy to be with you and with your audience. My family had a wonderful life in Cuba, but there was a communist revolution. Fidel Castro marched into Havana on January 1st, 1959, and that's when life changed for all Cubans. First thing he did, confiscate the guns. Next thing he did was start to indoctrinate the children to spy and inform on their parents. He also began to nationalize every company, every business, every little small business. The government was now in charge. And that's what happened to my family's businesses. And you have to realize also my mother and her parents escaped the Nazis. They escaped Lithuania in 1940. They were not able to get into the United States. So they had already lost everything once. They got into Cuba, and they started a business there. So that side of the family had a very good textile business. My father's side of the family was in sugar. My grandfather on my father's side of the family was one of the largest sugar producers in the world at the time. And all of that was just taken. Castro's people marched into the companies and said, "You're no longer needed here. This company now belongs to the Cuban people." My father.
And
yes.
You know, Leora, talk to me about how that informs your fight for freedom. Your family, I think it's such a fascinating story. Your family lost not once, but twice everything because the government came in and said, "This is not yours, it is ours, and we are going to take it away from you. You now are a ward of the state. This business belongs to the state." So when you look at the world today, how does that family struggle that you have lived through inform your life?
Well, I am very aware of government influence, government overreach into our lives and into the running of businesses, and with over-regulation, with over-taxation, with comments by Democrat leaders. I think it was Elizabeth Warren who said, "You didn't build that." Well, somebody,
Yes.
somebody built it, and it was a lot of hard work by individuals, by free and independent individuals who took an initiative, took risks with their own capital, their own money, and spent the time and put in the effort, had the original idea of what to do. The way my grandfather got to Cuba to go into the sugar business, he went there in 1920 and took over some foreclosed sugar mills. They were defunct. They weren't operating. And he turned them into a viable, successful business.
And then as your parents came in 1960, to the U.S.
Yes.
Where did they go, and how did they, for a third time, rebuild a life?
Well, first, I came with my mother and my sister. My father had a very hard time getting out. He was missing for 6 months. You can imagine, my mother was in her 20s. She had 2 little girls and a third on the way. And she didn't know if her husband was alive or dead. There was no communication, no email, no texting. If he had somehow tried to get a message out, he would have been discovered. He hid in many places. First, the American embassy. He was born in Cuba, but his parents were American citizens, so he was an American citizen. The ambassador kicked him out after a few days, saying it was too dangerous for the embassy to keep him because Castro was looking for them. The reason Castro was looking for him, he was considered an enemy of the Cuban people because when they nationalized his company, he had a check from a customer in his pocket. He went to the bank to try to cash the check, and they accused him of stealing from the Cuban people. Castro was looking for him to take him to El Parador, which means the wall. And what they did was they just did the trial. There was no trial. They took people to the wall and they shot them. And he hid in the embassy. He was kicked out. He hid in the Mayorkas apartment. The Mayorkas family and my family go way back to when our parents were children growing up in Cuba in school together. And the Mayorkases had left Cuba. Alejandro Mayorkas came here.
You are referencing the DHS secretary,
Correct.
Alejandro Mayorkas.
He is the Secretary of Homeland Security who has stood up and said to the Cubans last July, if you take to the water, you will not come here. So my dad hid in their empty apartment because he was already here. That family was already here. They had escaped as well. And he was brought here for freedom. And yet, you know what he does. Nevertheless, he had a hard time. He eventually got out. He eventually made his way to the airport. He was pulled out of line because they realized who he was, put in a room with a guard. The guard at one point, while his flight that he had bought a ticket for was on the tarmac, waiting to take off. The propellers were going. The guard looked at his watch and said, it's my lunchtime. I'm going to lunch. There's your plane. And he left, and we'll never know why. My dad
that's a fascinating story.
Showed up in Miami one day.
That is wonderful, and I'm so glad they made it to freedom and built that life. And now you have 3 sons.
Yes,
and
I do.
That really is, I know from knowing you, I know that having those children and building that legacy of freedom is something that is so vitally important to you.
Absolutely.
And I know that you've been standing up against CRT and standing up for parental rights. I know that is important to you. So talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I wake up every day and thank God that I am an American woman waking up as a free and independent citizen. I am the mother of 3 wonderful sons. And if anybody had told me when they were in school that I could not be involved with their curriculum, that I would be called a domestic terrorist if I wanted to be involved with their curriculum, they would have had more than a tiger mom to deal with. I was the mom who volunteered for everything. I was class mom, team mom, drove for every field trip, whatever I could do to be involved. That's what I did. And I completely support parents for their efforts to make sure that their children get a good education, that they are taught to love their country. They are taught real history. They're taught English, math, real science. Those are the topics our schools should be teaching, not politically induced critical race theory, which I call cultural Marxism. Critical race theory tells white children that they are inherently oppressors, no matter what they do, and they tell Black children that they are victims and they cannot succeed without favoritism and support from the government. Well, that is just false, and it's insulting to everybody, frankly, and it's an effort to divide us. You know, I grew up in the Jim Crow South. I saw real racism in action. There is no systemic racism in this country in 2022. What I saw in the South in the 1970s, late 60s and 70s, there were individuals, there were people, there were laws that were racist, but that has changed, and they are not. The country is not systemically racist. Critical race theory is an effort to divide us. It is an effort to reverse the success of integration. I went to the public schools in Charlotte, North Carolina. I stayed there, even though I had the opportunity to go to private school. I refused. I stayed because I believed in integration. I believe that we are all entitled to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so I was part of the solution, not part of the problem. I will not let them resegregate our society in the name of their critical race theory.
And you've also been a big supporter of our U.S. military and served as a director for Soldiers Strong. So what led you to that participation?
Well, I've always been in awe and committed to our military. I have two uncles who served, one in the Marines, one in the Navy in World War II. I have cousins who have served in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I feel we owe a great debt to our active duty and to our veterans. It is because of their sacrifice and their willingness to risk everything, including their lives, to be separated from their families. That is why we are able to live free here in America. And what the American military service members have done, not only for our country, but for every country in the world, by going to Europe and to Asia in World War II, to free them from tyranny, to free them from the Nazis, to free them from the dictatorship in Japan that was trying to overtake the Asian, to overtake Asia. All we asked for, as President Reagan said, was a little plot of land on which to bury our dead. And American children need to know that. They need to know their legacy.
Yes, we go in to free people, not to conquer people.
That's correct.
And I think that's an important difference. Well, our podcast is called Freedom Rings. So very quickly before we wrap, I'd love for you to say what freedom means to you and why it is worth the fight.
Freedom to me is the fact that I can wake up in a country having come here with nothing and be living an American dream. I'm now running for U.S. Senate. And you see this pin I'm wearing? I received this pin because President Trump nominated me to be ambassador to Chile. So here I came as a 3-year-old, not even speaking English. And fast forward, in 2019, President Trump nominated me to be an ambassador. I received this pin when I graduated from the School of Foreign Service. And this is possible in the United States of America because of the opportunity here. If people work for it, there is opportunity here for everyone. We are not guaranteed equal outcome, but we do have the opportunity to achieve whatever outcome, whatever dream we have for ourselves. That's what freedom means to me.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I am just delighted that our listeners have had the opportunity to meet you and to hear from you. I know that you are the clear conservative choice in this race in Connecticut, and I was so pleased to endorse you in your run for the U.S. Senate, and I look forward to having you bring your fight for freedom to Washington, D.C. And for our audience, if you would like to know more about Leora Levy, you can follow her on Twitter at Leora Levy CT, on Facebook at Leora Levy, and on her website at leora4ct.com. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I plan to be the 51st reliable Republican vote and stand shoulder to shoulder with you, Marcia, in the Senate to make sure we can fight for the American families, for American people, and make sure they have their own American dream and are able to achieve it.
Thank you so much for joining us for Freedom Rings.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom Rings. You can follow me on Twitter at Vote Marcia, Facebook at Marcia Blackburn for Senate, and on Instagram at Team Marcia. And you can always find us online at marciablackburn.com. The Freedom Rings podcast is edited and produced by Jared Cummings. Executive producers are Conservative Partnership Center and Marcia Blackburn. Together, we make Freedom Ring.